Hi, everyone. I'm Father Roger Landry. It's May 18th, 2020, which is the exact 100th birthday of St. John Paul II. And to celebrate this feast day, I'd like to share with you a presentation I made for a conference I was giving on John Paul II's call to chaste love in the divine plan. It was one of the central themes of his entire life, as well as his priesthood, his work as a bishop, and his work as successor of St. Peter. And in order to be able to get to know St. John Paul II, it is crucial for us to get to know this. So if you'll allow me, I'll share the screen with you where I've prepared a presentation, and then we'll dive right in. For us to celebrate the 100th birthday of St. John Paul II, like to celebrate any saint, means to try to learn from that saint how to love Jesus and others better so that we can imitate what's emulable in their life. Sometimes it's impossible to imitate certain aspects of a saint. Few priests even will be able to imitate Padre Pio in the confessional. Few Christians in general will have his stigmata, for example. But it is important, in his case, for example, that we would learn how to pray as he prays, to take advantage of the gift of the Holy Eucharist as he did, to really love the sacrament confession as he did. Likewise with St. John Paul II, we can learn so much from him about where human love fits in the divine plan for us and for others, how to find that love and how to live in that love. I had the great privilege to know St. John Paul II, which is one of the reasons why I'm passionate to be able to do these presentations on him and try to bring some of his wisdom to new generations. I was in Rome as a seminarian, as a priest from 1995 to 2000, where I attended hundreds of liturgies and general audiences with him. I had the chance to go to the institute named after him for the study of marriage and family over at the Lateran University. And I also had the chance to get to converse with him 11 times, to be his incense bearer at St. Peter, to proclaim the 7th Old Testament reading from Ezekiel at the Easter Vigil, looking at him as I was about to do it straight over the tomb of his predecessor. I had a chance to concelebrate with him in his private chapel. I was asked by his secretary, Cardinal Givish, to read the gospel that day, and that gospel was Matthew 16, and I read it in Latin, which says, "Tu es Petrus, et super hanc Petrum edificabo ecclesiam meam." You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I had the chance to introduce my parents to him, my twin brother to him, and so many other incredible experiences. These are some of the photos of those encounters. On the top left was when I met him June 27, 2000, and I told him I was returning to the Diocese of Fall River, Massachusetts to proclaim the gospel. He asked me what I would be doing. I said, be working with Portuguese immigrants as well as serving as a high school chaplain. He shouted out, "Giovani," young people. And I asked him if he had any advice, and he told me, "Yes, I do." He says, if they know you love them, they will listen and follow you. So I tried to live by that. In the top right-hand corner, I introduced my parents to him. He gave us a few minutes at the end of one of these audiences, and I asked him if he'd give my parents a special blessing on their 30th anniversary. He said, "Volentieri," with willingness. And then mischievously at the end, he turned to me and he said, since you're already ordained, here's a blessing for the other father of the family, trying to bless my spiritual fatherhood. On the bottom left side was when I met him the day before I was ordained a transitional deacon in Rome with my classmates from the Pontifical North American College. On the right, I met him with my bishop at the time, then Bishop Sean O'Malley, now Cardinal of Boston, my good friend, Monsignor Gerard O'Connor. Looks like I'm giving him rosary beads, but he has just given me rosary beads, which I used for many years, not just to pray for him, but to pray to the same lady that he very much loved, Jesus' mother. On the left side, you see after I had served him as a incense bearer in St. Peter's, one of the times I concelebrated with him in the top right. And the bottom was the last time I met him. Just 7 months before he died, I brought a pilgrimage group to have a chance to meet him, and we were given the privilege to have our photo taken with him. And as the cameras were snapping, I felt somebody's hand on my head, which was very weird, and I was about to get angry at one of the members of the pilgrimage. But when I turned around after the photos had stopped, I saw that the hand on my head was attached to a white cassock. And I asked him in Italian what that meant, Holy Father. And he said to me in reply, mischievously again, "Un giorno saprai," one day you'll know. I thought it would raise my dead hair follicles, but it didn't. But whatever that means, I was very moved when I was bringing the group on up, and the Archbishop was about to present the group to him formally. And he recognized me, and he called me by the nickname he had for me, was Gemello Americano, American twin, because one of the times that I met him was with my twin brother, and we made him laugh very much. And so these are just some of the experiences that I had with him. Let's get into the heart of this topic. John Paul II said in a book-length interview in 1994 that he felt almost an inner call. Mother Teresa would call it a vocation within a vocation, from early in his priesthood to help young people live their vocation to love, precisely by helping them to learn from Jesus how to love. As a young priest, he said in that interview, I learned to love human love. And this has been one of the fundamental themes of my priesthood, my ministry in the pulpit, in the confessional, and also in my writing. He wrote as Pope in his first encyclical, man can't live without love. His life is senseless if he doesn't find it, if he doesn't experience it, make it his own, if he doesn't participate intimately in it. He said in that interview, though, that young people need guides and want them close at hand, and he sought to be that guide and remain very close to young people. First, as a university chaplain in Krakow, where he used to go door to door in the dorms, trying to invite people to take their souls seriously. He was a professor in Lublin, the Catholic university there, and he taught classes on the ethics of human love. He led groups of young people on hikes into the beautiful Polish mountains. We could take their questions and teach a little bit away from the authorities, who were communist at the time and trying to suppress all institutions outside of the Communist Party, including the family, and to take away other allegiances like love from allegiance to communist thinking. He taught and wrote between 1958 and 1960 what became his classic Love and Responsibility, as well as various plays on the themes of human love and marriage. Most famously, he gave us 5 years of General Wednesday audience catecheses in St. Peter's Square on what's become known as his theology of the body, or what he called human love in the divine plan, or the redemption of the body and the sacramentality of marriage. This is the richest teaching that's ever been given to the church on how the sacrament of marriage fits into God's plan for salvation. But we likewise know how he spent time with children on World Youth Days, young people from all over the world, being with them and taking their questions. He always met them when he went on his 104 trips, arranging special times just to encourage young people. And early in his pontificate, he would regularly have meetings just for big university groups and things that had come in, so that he would be able to encourage them, not just as Christians, but particularly to learn how to insert that great desire for love, because our life is lost without it, into Christ's plan to fill that hole, because he knew, as St. Augustine said, that our hearts will be restless unless they're really resting in God, unless they're resting in his love. Why is chastity so important? Why did St. John Paul II constantly teach about this virtue? The reason is because the opposite of love is not hatred, but it's lusting after others and using others. Love, we know, is willing the other's good for the sake of the other, not for selfish purposes, but for the good of that person. The greatest love, Jesus told us during the Last Supper, is laying down one's life for one's friends. But John Paul II said lust changes the entire intentionality of a person, the direction in which we head, from a giver to a taker, from someone who sacrifices himself for the sake of the other to someone who sacrifices others for one's own gratification. Chastity, he said, is the virtue that neutralizes this lust and keeps love loving. In Love and Responsibility, that great book that he wrote whilst the young people were growing up under communism, he said that he was intentionally trying to introduce love into love by which he meant to introduce Christ-like agape, that call of Jesus to love one another as he has loved us, into the human experience of eros, or romantic love. The big project of his papacy was to help us all grow in the universal call to holiness, summoning us, no matter what our stage of life or our age, to the fullness of the Christian life, to true sanctity. What does sanctity mean? It means to become like God, to grow as his image and likeness, to be holy as he is holy, ultimately to love as he loves. And St. Paul tells us this is God's will for you, your holiness. But then immediately thereafter, he says, therefore, abstain from porneia, a Greek term that refers to all sexual sin and is generally translated as unchastity. We can see the word pornography there, which is writing unchastity, or pornovision, as John Paul II called it, looking unchastely at other human beings. To become a saint, St. Paul was telling us, we have to be chaste. Sanctity is the perfection of love, and we can't love if we're lusting at the same time. Therefore, we can't love without chastity. But probably no part of our Catholic faith and life is caricatured, contradicted, criticized, calumniated, and condemned as Catholic moral teaching on chastity. Many view it as something as outdated as Victorian clothing, as a path of repression rather than love, as a school of freaks rather than saints. They charge that it's against our biology, shackling a natural urge, against our rational nature, restraining our freedom, even against God's plans for us by impeding the life of joy God intends. In short, they regard the Church's teachings on chastity as bad news rather than good. We have to ask ourselves before we get to John Paul II's answers, is the culture that trumpets the right to sex with whomever we want, whenever we want, wherever we want, however we want, brought us happiness or heartache? One of the reasons why chastity isn't practiced as much as it is because it's often misunderstood, including by very good Catholics who otherwise know their faith, comes from a terminological confusion. When the Catechism emphasized, for example, that all Christ faithful are called to lead a chaste life in keeping with their particular states in life, and that married people are called to live conjugal chastity, many married couples are left scratching their heads, wondering how they can both conceive children and be chaste at the same time. Confusion stems from misunderstanding what chastity means. For example, we use chastity training to talk about sexual education classes to teenagers who are supposed to be abstaining from all sexual activity. We also use the vow of chastity to refer to, for example, women and men in religious orders who will never marry. So people can think that chastity means abstinence on the one hand or the state of being unmarried on the other. But chastity isn't continence, which is abstinence from sexual activity. It's also not celibacy, which is the state of being unmarried. Those who are unmarried are called to chaste continence or chaste abstinence. And those in religious life or the priesthood are called to chaste celibate continence. We can't shorten what's going on just to the term chastity. Otherwise, people get confused and thinking chastity means never having sexual relations, even if one is married. The Catechism of the Catholic Church links chastity chiefly to the virtue of temperance, which is moderation or self-control in the pleasures that we have. It says that it's the fruit of a spiritual effort. It's an apprenticeship in self-mastery by which we learn to govern our passions rather than let ourselves be dominated by them. It says that the goal is the successful integration of sexuality within the person and therefore the inner unity of man and his bodily and spiritual being. When we're not chaste, we know that our conscience is telling us one thing, but our body is saying something else, and that's an inner disunity. Chastity brings all of that back into harmony because we're no longer slaves to our sexual urge. And so chastity understood as temperance, moderating the sexual urge so that we're able to channel it in right direction rather than let us drag us in wrong direction, is in general the Catechism's approach. This is the traditional understanding of chastity. But for St. John Paul II, it wasn't sufficient. He didn't think that moderating the sexual urge was enough to understand the beauty of the virtue of chastity. He said we need to orient the sexual urge appropriately so that it brings about communion rather than merely stops the sexual urge from destroying communion. He had written some essays in the early 1970s in which he described the sexual urge as a gift of God, drawing us outside of ourselves, helping us to recognize that we're not whole without human love being found. The sexual urge is a gift that leads us past the mistake of self-sufficiency to look for those to love, so that in loving we might become more and more like God. Love and responsibility, therefore. He wrote that chastity is linked likewise to love. Chastity is the moral habit that raises our attractions to another person, to the dignity of the person as a whole. Why did he define it that way? Because there's so often a temptation to reduce others to the values of the body or their erogenous zones. We can abstract certain body parts from the personal good. That's why in some pornographic images, they don't even show the face because the whole person doesn't matter. It's just, for example, the body that matters. There's also a temptation, he recognized, to use another in one's own mind, for example, through pornography, or in one's body through sins, for one's own sensual or emotional gratification. Many people in our culture, he says, consensually use each other sexually in this way. This mutual utilitarianism or harmonious hedonism, he says, will never lead us to true love. It'll be like drinking salt water. We'll never really find it, and we'll just get thirsty. And it could end up killing us. In his theology of the body, St. John Paul II went even further in his teaching on chastity. He linked chastity first to the virtue of purity. Remember from the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus told us, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." Purity is the virtue that allows us to see God in others, to recognize a reflection of his image in them, to see something of love incarnate of the divine giver. When we're looking at somebody else with pure eyes, we recognize, as C.S. Lewis said, they're not a mere mortal, but somebody calling us to love them with the love with which God loves them. He also linked chastity to the virtue of piety. Piety is not holding your hands and kneeling straight. Piety is the habit that once we have seen God in others, leads us to be able to revere them out of reverence for God. St. Paul wrote in his beautiful 5th chapter of his letter to the church in Ephesus, "Husbands and wives, be subordinate to each other out of reverence for Christ." They were to serve each other because they recognized that they needed to treat others as they wanted to treat Christ. Christ said in St. Matthew's Gospel that he takes personally the way we treat others. He said that when he judges us, he'll come and he'll say, "I was hungry, and either you gave me food or you didn't. I was thirsty, and you either gave me drink or you didn't. I was naked." We can say either you lusted after me or took advantage of me, or you reverenced me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me, or you stiffed me. Jesus says whatever we do or fail to do for the least of his brothers and sisters, we do or fail to do to him. And how much more is that supposed to be the case with the ones that we are called to love as our closer neighbors? So that's why St. Paul was able to call husbands and wives to treat each other with reverence, with the virtue of piety, as they would treat Christ himself. Linked to piety, chastity helps us to see the other as a sacred subject rather than a sexual object. So chastity is connected to all 4 of these virtues: self-control or temperance, love or laying down our life for the sake of the other, sacrificing ourselves for the other's good, rather than ever taking advantage of another for our own pleasure, to purity in which we see just how precious they are in God's eyes and look at them as a temple of the Holy Spirit that we would never desecrate, and piety, in which we begin to act in correspondence to that vision, the way we would treat even the Blessed Sacrament with incredible reverence. Other people are not Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, but it's closer to the way we treat the Blessed Sacrament, the way we're supposed to treat them, to the way that we would just treat people with whom we just had a utilitarian relationship. Chastity is what St. John Paul II says helps us to keep our eros, or our romantic love, capable of philia, our love for friends, and agape, or Christ-like love. That's the verb Jesus uses, agape, when he says, love one another as I have loved you. And no one has greater agape than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Living chastely, we have to insist on this, doesn't relegate others to a loveless life, but it provides the conditions for the possibility of any true love. Many times teenagers called to chastity, or those with same-sex attraction, or who experience gender identity issues, can begin to think that the church teaching is too onerous, that it renders them into a chaste, continent, celibate lifestyle the whole rest of their life, and therefore no love. And when people sometimes say that to me, I ask, do I look miserable to you? The church is just asking you to do what chaste, continent, celibate, priests, and religious do. It's possible. It can be life-giving. It can be totally joyful. It's not being locked in a subterranean Vatican dungeon without love for the rest of our life. But if we're ever going to have true love, we have to have chastity, because lust destroys even the love of friendship that can exist between, for example, two people of the same sex or two people of the opposite sex. And it can destroy that Christian agape, without which we cannot grow in God's image and likeness. Let's specifically talk about the application of marriage. Husbands and wives are called to chastity in their marriage. What does that mean? It doesn't mean abstinence. It means reverence for each other as a sacred gift. It means that they'll try to raise their attractions to the good of the person as a whole, including the good of the person's soul. What an act of violence it is when one spouse leads the other spouse into sinful activity, whereas they're supposed to be helping the other person grow in sanctity. They're not leading the person to holiness, but horniness. It means fully accepting the paternal meaning of the man's masculinity and the maternal meaning of a woman's femininity. This is so important when the subject comes to contraception. By using contraception like a condom or a pill or some type of implant, what we're dealing with is in the very act made by God for one's maternal meaning of her femininity or maternal meaning of his masculinity to be shown, that aspect of the other is being rejected. And rather than fully giving oneself to the other and receiving the other's total self-gift, it's kind of like pressing the gas pedal and the brake in the same time in the car. You're saying yes and no at the same time, which only leads to great tension and fear. And it can start to corrode the love that's really there. That's totally different, for example, than the use of natural family planning. Use of natural family planning, you chart the woman's natural biological rhythms. And then if there's a serious reason not to conceive a child at a given point, you can have recourse to those times in her cycle in which she can't conceive a child. What the moral action there is not a rejection of, for example, the woman, but it's the embracing of the woman, just as God made her with these cyclical rhythms to her hormones and to her fertility. And God put those there for a reason. And it's not contrary to his plan when there's a serious reason not to have children that a couple makes love during those specific time periods. Totally different from what's happening in contraception. Chastity in marriage also means avoiding all adultery of the heart, but looking at each other with purity, piety, and love. You remember in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus says that the man who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That doesn't just mean men, for example, looking at those who are not their wives with lust. That's clearly the adultery in the heart that he's talking about. But when men begin to look at their own wives with lust, even though they couldn't commit adultery in the flesh because they're married, they can commit adultery in the heart because he's lusting after her. And so often in my work as a priest, I've had to hear some of the stories of women who have been lusted after by their husbands and used, and basically being asked to reenact disgusting scenes in pornographic film to satisfy the man's lust, and the woman feels so degraded. That's why chastity is so important in marriage, so that love making actually makes love, increases it, rather than becomes an act of using in which unchastity begins to lessen the love that's there. Let's talk a little bit about chastity outside of marriage. All those who are unmarried are called to chaste abstinence. Pornography, masturbation, fornication, which means sex outside of marriage, oral sex, anal sex. All of these are practices inconsistent with one's and the other's genuine good, with treating oneself or the other with the reverence befitting a temple of the Holy Spirit. Pornography, that means making porn or pornovision, watching porn, abstracts a person's sexual values from the person's overall good. And that's the exact opposite of what chastity helps us to do. Fornication, or sex outside of marriage, takes advantage of another to whom one has not made a total commitment for one's pleasure. Could two people who fornicate love each other? Possibly, but they're not making love when they have sex. Why not? Because love means this total gift of oneself to another. And it's not total if one's not planning to live the whole rest of one's life with another. And if one is, then why doesn't one get married? Ultimately, to become one flesh with someone else, the church teaches we need to have been made one flesh with that person by the sacrament of marriage. And that's why we wait. Sometimes when couples have come to me for marriage preparation and they haven't been living by the church's teaching, you want to embrace them where they are and lead them to where the church wants. And it's a good thing that they're coming to get married. But when we start to talk about living a Lent before their Easter and living their engagement chastely, sometimes they're hesitant because they've already gotten used to some of these maritally exclusive pleasures outside of marriage. And so somewhat jocularly, but they don't know it at the time, I said, well, listen, I'll leave the call up to you. If you want to continue doing what you're doing, here's a photo of all my altar boys. I'll have one of them celebrate your marriage. And they look at me kind of wondering if I'm joking. And if you want to live chastely, then I'll celebrate your marriage. And at first they don't get it. You might not be getting it back home. But I said, listen, these altar boys, some of them have vocations to be priests later, but they're not priests yet. But we'll have, if you're going to live as if you're husband and wife before God joined you as husband and wife, why don't we let one of them pretend that he is a priest, that he is a priest before he actually has been ordained by God to be a priest. And they kind of get the analogy that even though one is called to something, when one is not something yet, one shouldn't be behaving as if one is. During the COVID-19 crisis, one of the things that I started to notice, I had many couples who had weddings planned. Some of them have kept their wedding dates. Some of them postponed their wedding dates. And what I started to notice is those couples that had made chastity during engagement a really obvious part of the way they were relating to each other. They were the ones who were always going through with the wedding. Those who were not conspicuously chaste, and I wasn't judging the couples, but they're always together in the same place at home, these types of things where even though the addresses are a little bit different in some of their self-descriptions, they're always talking about preparing breakfast for each other and things like this. So it doesn't require Mensa certification in order to be able to figure out what must be going on. A lot of those couples were delaying their marriage until the time where they could have it with all their guests. What's involved there? one of the things that I started to see was that the couples who were really living chastely recognized that their wedding day was a totally new reality. It wasn't just a celebration with their family and friends. It was a time in which there's a before and an after. And the after means living as husband and wife in all that fullness. And they were excited for that. And they were willing to lose everything else for that reality of marriage. Whereas some of the couples that were not obviously chaste, it seemed that what was happening there was that because they may have already been living as husband and wife, even though they weren't, that what they really were looking forward to in marriage was a big public celebration of their love with their family and their friends, because there's not one big before and after other than that public celebration in church and in the reception. Something to think about. I was very impressed with those couples that went ahead with weddings with only 10 guests because they recognized they had a vocation to marriage rather than just to a wedding day. Same-sex activity rejects the meaning of masculinity or femininity and the natural ordering toward the gift of life. Doesn't mean those with same-sex attractions are called to a loveless life, but they are called to a sexless life, just like everybody else who's not married to a person of the opposite sex, just like me. The only context in which lust is avoided is when there's a commitment to the total person of the other, to the true good of the other, and a mutual exchange of sexual gifts, not just momentarily, which can be utilitarian, for example, a one-night stand until the following day, but to a relationship without an expiration date. Sexual activity is only moral when it's loving, not lustful. Lovemaking is truly loving only in a loving marriage, when couples express in body language that one flesh union made by God of the making of the whole that their mutual self gives. To grow in chastity, based on what St. John Paul II has taught us, we must work on growing in self-control, in sacrificial love, in purity, and in piety toward God and others. The four virtues we've already talked about. But there are other traditional means the Church has posed that we can ponder to grow in chastity, no matter what our state of life is. Prayer, asking God for this gift. St. Augustine prayed, as we find out in his Confessions, Lord, give me chastity, but not yet. He still wanted the pleasures of a concubinage with someone to whom he wasn't married, rather than what God really was asking of him and the holiness that would flow from it. We're called to say, Lord, give me chastity and give it to me yesterday. Spiritual self-discipline, like fasting. If we're able to control our appetite for food, for example, it's so much easier to control our sex appetite or our irascible appetite, the appetite that leads us to be angry and to express and to stew. The type of fasting that I generally urge is not binge fasting, like don't eat a thing on a Wednesday or a Friday, or just fast on bread and water on a given day. People can do that. That is helpful, but especially for people struggling with lust, it's not the most helpful because, for example, they may be able to abstain from lustful activities for a few days or a few weeks, but then when they break it, they're kind of like somebody who fasts for a day and then on the next day makes up for 2 days less food. And that can similarly happen where people begin almost to binge lust after their binge abstinence. So the type of fasting I normally encourage people to do as a priest are the things that others won't notice, but can really impact our will over the course of time. Exercising our spiritual muscles of saying yes to God and our no to certain pleasure so that we can use that strengthened muscle in the area of chastity. So for example, drinking just water. Your doctors will be grateful, but giving up soda, giving up booze, giving up milk, giving up juice, every time you have something to drink, it will be a time in which you're saying yes to something that is truly pure. Water is a great reminder of that. I generally encourage people to give up all condiments on their food, ketchup, salt and pepper, sugar, butter. Because if we're able to go without a little bit of that extra taste, we're not losing any nutrition if we do it. But if we're able to go without the pleasure of the better taste, Again, it's easier for us to be able to say no when our sexual urge is trying to lead us to things that we know would not be ordered to God. Similarly, if we give up desserts, not fruit, for example, but if we give up chocolate cake, if we give up cookies, if we give up ice cream, we can grow in that capacity to say no to our desires for things our body likes in order to be able to say yes to the things that our soul needs. Friendship is another traditional means. The more we have real loving friendships with others, the less we'll be able to be tempted by the devil to think that what we're really missing is some type of sexual relationship with somebody else. Service, the more we're giving of ourselves, sacrificing ourselves for others, the more we're strengthening our intentionality in the image of God. When we're not sacrificing for others, we might begin to get self-centered. And when we are thinking about ourselves so much, that's when we're vulnerable to trying to satisfy some of our bodily temptations. Sacrament of reconciliation is such a huge help for us if we happen to fall in the area of chastity, to just go to the priest and just get it out and say, bless me, Father, for I've sinned. It's been this long since my last confession. Here are my sins. And then just tell what we've said. It's not going to be the first time, I promise you. Priests have heard these sins, and they understand sometimes that it's a struggle. Likewise, there can be other help. One of the reasons why we're engaged in unchaste behavior, it might be because of some of the traumas we would have experienced earlier in life. And so the psychological sciences might be able to help us with some of the psychological responses that happen as a result of having endured what unfortunately too many people have had to endure because of lust in society that takes advantage of innocent younger people. To avoid activities that foster unchastity. There are a lot of parties, there are a lot of bars where there's an unchaste culture, and you add alcohol to the mix where we lose a little bit of self-mastery, just makes it much easier for us to cave in. Last, I'll mention, we need not to live by the standards of the world, but by Christ's standards. The world will tell us that, listen, everybody's doing it. Don't be an old prude. Get with it. Live in the modern age. And we just need to say, sorry, I want to live forever with Christ. I want to remain always young. And the way to do that is not by trying to adapt myself to what's just happening in 2020 or 1969 or whatever. It's to live with God in the present. And so to have the courage to live by Christ's standards rather than the ways of the world. This is the essence of what it means as a Christian. That's an introduction to one of the most incredible times that John Paul II talked about sexuality, which was when he made an apostolic trip to the Netherlands in 1985. Holland was, and still is in many ways, in trouble in terms of faith. What was once a vibrant Catholic culture really began to quickly go downward. The Christians were losing their salt and their light, unfortunately. When John Paul II went, he was protested throughout, especially by those who hated the church's sexual teachings. And in a time where he was meeting with young people, when it got to the question and answer period, there were a lot of very provocative questions challenging church teaching in the areas of sexuality, and more or less as a mob calling for the church to change. John Paul II wasn't afraid of these tough questions. He listened to them all, and then afterward, he gave a response. And it's an incredible response that brings us straight to the heart of the gospel. Listen to me as we ponder these words. He says, "Dear friends," and they were young. Over 100,000 young people were present. "Allow me to be very honest with you. Are you really sure that the idea you have of Christ fully corresponds to the reality of his person?" Or were they saying, Christ calls us to love one another, and we should be able to love the people that we choose without the limits of the church, and we'll define love to being LUV, or lust. John Paul II said, are you sure that you're understanding Christ correctly when he says, love one another as I have loved you? The gospel and truth, he went on, presents us with a very demanding Christ, not an indulgent one, who invites us to a radical conversion of heart, to detachment from earthly good, to the pardon of offenses, to the love of enemies, to the patient endurance of abuses, even to the sacrifice of one's life for one's neighbor. In particular, concerning the sexual sphere, the firm position taken by him in defense of the indissolubility of marriage. Remember when the Pharisees came up and said, is it right, as Moses said, for us to be able to divorce our wives? Jesus said in the beginning it was not so. Jesus defended the indissolubility of marriage. In John Paul II went on, Jesus' defense and condemnation pronounced even regarding simple adultery of the heart are well known. We've already talked about that, Matthew 5:27 and 28. How can we fail to be struck by the precept to gouge out one's eye or cut off one's hand if these members are an occasion of scandal? Having these precise gospel references, is it realistic to imagine a permissive Christ in the realm of married life and the questions of abortion or premarital, extramarital, or homosexual relations? The obvious answer to that is no. Christ calls us, he challenges because he knows with his help we're capable of living up to it. John Paul II went on, in her teaching, the church never pronounces a judgment regarding concrete persons. We don't judge others. But at the level of principles, we do make judgments, distinguishing good from evil. Why? Because permissiveness doesn't make man happy. Drinking poison doesn't quench one's thirst. He finished, young friends, this then is my response. Love Christ and accept the demands that the church makes upon you in his name, because they're the demands that come from God, the creator and redeemer of man. Accept these demands in your life and you will discover their value. Sometimes we're only going to be able to appreciate something from the inside. These are very countercultural words, but he was essentially saying Christ, out of love for us, calls us to his standard of love, not lust. And these practices of abortion, premarital, extramarital, and homosexual relations, he says, are lustful, not ultimately loving. What is his positive response to the whole summons to love? He gave it in a beautiful 1985 letter to the young people of the world called Dilecti Amici, or Beloved Friends. Here's some of his thoughts there about how to grow a culture of love in contrast to the culture of lust in which so many of our contemporaries live and cave into. The heart of youth, one of the central questions of human life, he says, is also one of the main biblical themes, the great sacrament of marriage and the experience of love. The call to love calls from God himself, created man in his own image and likeness, precisely as man and woman. He created us from love for love. I ask you not to break off your conversation with Christ, he says, in this extremely important phase of your youth, but to commit yourselves even more to that conversation with Christ, which is prayer, that conversation of existence, which is following Jesus. Listen, we've been made in God's image, who is love. And if you were the devil, and if you wanted to attack those made in his image and likeness, what would you do? You try to attack love. Because if you can corrupt love, you can corrupt the person's union with God. You can corrupt the person's union with others. We see that with Adam and Eve at the beginning. And you can corrupt the person's inner unity, such that one is constantly afraid and covering oneself, full of shame. The devil's constantly trying to attack love in the heart of marriage. And we need to be alert to this. St. John Paul II is going to propose the antidote, keeping that conversation alive with Christ, hearing his demands, but also receiving his help to live up to those demands so that we can experience the joy he came into the world to give us. He wrote, when Christ says, follow me, very often his call means follow me, the bridegroom of the church. Come, you too, become the bridegroom of your bride or the bride of your husband. Become sharers in that mystery, that sacrament, which the letter of the Ephesians says is something great in reference to Christ and the church. That's Ephesians 5. He says, much depends on the fact that you follow Christ on this path, that you don't run away from him when you're occupied with this matter, that you rightly consider the great event of your heart. To keep love loving means to keep it in Christ, To set out on the path of the married vocation means, he says, to learn married love day by day, year by year. Love according to body and soul. That doesn't mean that you start to learn it beginning day one of your marriage. It means you're preparing for it, that you're already in some type of relationship with your future spouse whom you haven't even met yet, if you think God's given you the vocation of marriage. If you, let's just say you're going to be married when you're 25 years old and you're 15. How can I live at 15 such that my future spouse at 25 is going to be proud and is going to be happy? Does the person want me to be promiscuous now, or does the person want me to be faithful to my future wife and family by the choice I'm making now? We learn the virtues of married life starting very young in the home. We need to cultivate those virtues. It is precisely this love that young people need if your married future is going to pass the test of the whole of your life. Many times in life, it's been my task, he said, looking back with joy, to accompany, in a sense, more closely this love of young people. I've come to understand just how essential, how important, and how great it is. To a large extent, listen to this, the future of humanity is decided upon the paths of this love, initially youthful, which you and she or you and he discover along the paths of your youth. The future of humanity passes by way of the family. And for the family to be strong, it's got to be prepared for so that it will be strong when it comes, rather than arriving very broken. John Paul II says this can be called a great adventure, but it's also a great task. It's an adventure because it's lived with Christ, and it's a great responsibility we have for our own soul, for the souls of the others who will be entrusted to us, and also in our relationship with God. Let's make some concluding thoughts. Since the future of humanity is decided along the path of chaste human love, we see how important this virtue of chastity is, not only for individuals hoping one day to get married, for better or worse, in poverty or prosperity, in sickness and health all their days, but for the future of all humanity. Chastity is essential for love, for self-respect, and for reverential concern of others. It's essential for happy marriages. It's essential for happy priestly and religious vocations. It's essential, as St. Paul tells us, for holiness. And therefore, it's indispensable for heaven, to which love, the sacrament of marriage, holy orders, and religious life and holiness all lead. That's why the Church, following the extraordinary leadership of St. John Paul II, continues to proclaim the call to chaste love today. At the end of this presentation, we turn to St. John Paul II on his 100th birthday, knowing that he's praying for us right now, that we might receive this challenging message given to us by him for Christ and respond to the help that he's interceding for Christ to give us, that we might live up to it with the same joy with which John Paul II did and has inspired countless millions to do. St. John Paul II, pray for us. Thank you for listening.